Hello, today we are going to have a look at how to create an iOS style switch in Excel with the functionality of clicking it to switch it on and clicking it again to switch it off. And we'll also take a look at how you could embed this in a settings style sheet, something like this, where you are using it to enable and disable the dark mode. Let's get started. Okay, so to start with, let's find an image of an iOS switch online so that we've got something as a reference to use. So if we just do a Google search, iOS switch, let's have a look on images. This one looks good. I'm just going to use the snipping tool to copy this image. Okay, let's take that and let's just paste it into Excel. Okay, so now we've got something that we can use as a bit of a guide for how the switch looks in the off and on positions. Okay, so let's insert a shape, and the shape we're going to need is the rounded rectangle. I'm going to drag this out to roughly the same size and roughly the same proportions, so it's going to be as round as possible. And then let's just bring this over here and we'll get it to a very similar size. That's pretty close. And obviously you could make this however you wanted it to. I'm trying to get it very close to this style of iOS switch, but it's up to you. If you wanted to make it thinner, fatter, with a smaller button, you could do anything. So now we've got that. Actually, first of all, let's colour this in. So take away the outline and we'll have a fill. I don't know if one of these, let's use that fill. Now as we're drawing out these shapes, I like to bring up the selection pane and keep track of the names of the shapes. So the picture one doesn't matter, that's what we've pasted in. Let's rename this to be button iOS on, and it's going to be the back. So it's the on version of the switch and it's the background. Okay, so next up let's draw the circle. So we're going to go insert shapes and select the circle. Now if you drag this out normally, you can see you can make it lots of different sizes. One trick in Excel, and this works for all shapes, if you hold shift as you drag things out, you'll get a perfectly sized and equal circle or whatever shape you're drawing out, which is obviously what we want here. So let's get this roughly the right size, about here. And then and again I'm going to hold shift to make sure I keep everything in balance. That's probably about right. So again, let's position this on our background. We'll get rid of the outline and we will fill it with white. And let's just position it. I'm just using the arrow keys to get a bit more of an exact position. And let's call this one button iOS on front. Now the one other thing that this button has that you can see is kind of a small shadow underneath. So let's add that into our shape here. To do that we're going to go to right click format shape, and on the shape options, the effects tab, shadow, we'll just add a preset. So this looks like it's a shadow underneath, so it's probably this one. And we could mess around with that, changing the size of the shadows or the depth. It looks pretty decent, to be honest. And again, you could have this however you want it, without shadows, make it look impressed, embossed, whatever you wanted to add. I'm just trying to reflect this version of the switch. So now that we have the on version of the switch complete, let's copy that for the off version. So I'm going to select both of these shapes and I'm going to drag while holding shift and control, which will just create a copy directly underneath. I'm going to go to my selection pane, and before we do anything else, let's just rename these two so they're going to be called exactly the same thing, except off instead of on. Now let's just move this across to the left, the off position, and let's colour this to a similar sort of grey. I think that one works quite well. Okay, so now we have an off switch and an on switch, and the way that we're going to work this is that we're going to set the button click so that if you click on the on switch, it shows the off switch, and if you click on the off switch, it shows the on switch. And so that we only have to tell Excel to hide or show one item, I'm going to group the switch together. So if I highlight them both, right click, group, and group, and I'll do the same for the off switch. And then up here I can name this group just to be button iOS on and button iOS off. So now we've got two distinct buttons that we'll be able to control from the code. So let's move now to the code screen. So we'll go to the Developer tab and hit Visual Basic. If you don't have this Developer tab available in the ribbon, you can just right-click anywhere on the ribbon and say Customize. And then on the right-hand side here, just make sure Developer is ticked. So from the Visual Basic window, let's insert a new module. And let's just create a function that's going to be iOS click. So we're going to fire this whenever we click on either of the buttons. So let's first of all get the button name that was clicked on. And we're also going to have a button action, and you'll see why we have this in a second. So the button name is just going to be assigned to application.caller. That will tell us the name of whatever was clicked on to fire this macro, which in this case will be either button's name. And from that, we want to define a button action. So what do we want to do? So let's just have a think based on the names that we've got here. Really, we want to pull either off if any of these three buttons are pressed, or on if any of these three buttons are pressed. So actually all we need to do is take off button iOS from the front of the button name and then take the next two letters. That will tell us what type of button has been pressed. So to do that, let's use the mid function. And we're going to say, okay, take the middle of this string. So we're going to give it button name. We're going to say, okay, start at the 7th character. So that's BTNIOS. That's 6 characters. The next one is the one we want to start at. And we just want to take 2 characters. And just to test that this is working, let's just message box out the button action. So now we've got this function called iOS click. Let's assign that to, well, let's just highlight everything here and assign it to all of this. Okay. So now, once we click the on button, no matter where we click, we're getting the word on. And if we click the off button, no matter where we click, we'll get the word, I mean, it's not off, it's off, but we know what that means in terms of what has been pressed. Going back to the code, let's now deal with what we want to do when these buttons come up. So if we say, if the button action equals on, then do one thing, else, and we can either say else and then put our stuff here, or we can say else if. And I'd usually add an else if in just in case we add anything further on this later on. So if the button action equals of, meaning off, then we'll do this thing. Okay, so if the button action is on, let's think about what will be happening. the on button is being clicked, which means the on button is currently visible, meaning that the action that's going to be taken is we're switching the button off. So we want to hide the on version of the button and show the off version of the button. So to do that, we know this sheet's just called sheet 1, so I'm just getting that from the sheet name up at the top here. So if I say sheet1.shapes, I can then access first of all, the on button, which is button iOS on. And I want to say, okay, dot visible equals false. And I then want to say the opposite, so I'm just going to copy this whole line and change this to off. The off button, we want to say visible equals true. And when we're clicking the off version of this, we want the exact opposite to happen. So I'm just going to swap around true and false. Okay, let's see if that actually works. So now when I click the on button, it disappears. And when I click the off button, that disappears and the on button reappears. Now, obviously these need to be in the same place for this to work. So let's view both of them again. And I'm now going to move this one exactly over the top of this one. So to do that, I'm going to go to Shape Format, Align, Top. And they're already pretty much aligned right and left, but I'll do align right as well. I think there's just a slight amount in it. So now when we click the off button, we get the on button, and when we click the on button, we get the off button. So we now have this on-off functionality. Now there's one more important setting that we need to make to these shapes. I'm just going to view the buttons all together, and I'm going to highlight them all so that everything is selected. Right click, Format Object. That is on the Size and Properties menu for the shapes. On Properties, I'm going to change this to Do Not Move or Size with Cells. At the moment, the problem that we've got is if a cell is resized, it's going to take that shape and it's going to distort it, which is not what we want here. We want it to be unaffected by the changing of any cells. We may still want to keep it so that if a cell in front of it is resized, it moves it around the page. That's not quite so bad, and we could keep that option in if we select the middle option of this property, move but don't size with cells. But for simplicity's sake for now, I'm just going to turn them both off. So now when we resize either a cell that is within the shape or before the shape, it has no effect to its on-screen position. Okay, so that's the button basically complete. Let's have a look as to how we might use it. So one common usage for this kind of button is to switch things on like a dark mode. So let's imagine we were on a settings page. I'm going to get rid of the grid lines, and let's just say we've got a single setting here for dark mode. And what we'll do is we'll resize this to something a little more reasonable. Maybe like that. And drag it over. Okay, so now when we click, we've got an on and off for the dark mode setting. Obviously it doesn't do anything yet. So let's go back to the developer tab and actually give this something to do. So we'll create a new function, and let's say this is going to be called dark mode, and we can give it a boolean that's either going to turn it on or off. So it'll be a true or false. True if we want to switch it on, false if we want to switch it off. So we'll just say, okay, on off as a boolean. So if on off, then something else, something else. So this is going to say if on and off is true, then do this, otherwise we're going to do this. So if we're turning dark mode on, we want to do two things. We want to switch the background to a darker color and the text to a lighter color. So to do that, we're going to go, okay, sheet 1 cells. And then for the background, we say interior.color. And that's going to take an RGB. Now, white is 255 for each of the three, the red, the green, the blue value. Black is 0 for each of those. So really, we want the background here to be a slightly lesser shade of black. So let's try 10, 10, 10. And let's make the text, so sheet1.cells, and you can see I get the helper up. So as soon as I start typing here, CE, cells pops up. I can press tab to auto-complete that. And then as soon as I press and start typing, font, FO, tab, and again this is just font.color. And again for this we'll say, okay, RGB, and again when I open the brackets I get the prompt telling me what's needed to be entered. So let's try for this maybe 240, and we'll see how that works. So to test this out, obviously I can't as normal go into here and press play because this function accepts an input. So to actually test it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it down here. So I'm going to say, okay, dark mode, true. I'm just going to hit return in the immediate window. If you don't have the immediate window up, so like this, you can just hit Control G and that will show it. So dark mode, true. And there we go. That looks pretty good. And then what we'll do is we'll make the opposite true for off. So we'll say, okay, we want the interior now to be 240, and we want the font to be the white color. So again, we'll do a quick test. So that's false. There we go. So now the only thing left to do is to call this function when the button click happens. So if the on button is being clicked, what we want to do here is we want to turn dark mode off. Because when you think about it, that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but if you're clicking the on button, it's already switched on and you're going to switch it off. So here we want to say call dark mode false. Now notice the way that I've called this function here. You could just say dark mode false, in which case you don't need the brackets, but I like to always use call when I'm calling functions because it just defines it, it shows it up in the method that you are calling to another function. If you're scanning through loads of lines of code and you just have this in the middle of it, it's a little bit hard to see. Whereas if you wanted to search for a function being called, you could always search for the keyword call and you'd see it straight away. So that's kind of why I like to have the syntax like this rather than like this. The only other change between the two is that when you are calling a function like this, you'll always need to use the parentheses to supply the argument. You cannot just have the space like you can if you're just calling it without the call keyword. Okay, so let's copy that then and set this one to be true. And let's see if that works. So we switch it off. Obviously no changes because it was already off. But now when we switch it on, we get the dark mode, switch it off. So that's kind of one little cool way that this button could be used in an application. If you had a settings page, whether that's on a dashboard or somewhere else within Excel, if you were doing this for an application, you would obviously have to make sure that the changes were reflected on every single one of your tabs, which is easy enough to cycle through sheets. We can look at that in another session, but that's essentially how it would work. If you've got any questions or comments, please put them down below. I will get back to you on anything. Please like the video if you found it useful and subscribe if you'd like to see more of this kind of thing. And I'll see you next time.